Bonjour, everyone. My name is Linda Witt, and I'm the president of the Fédération des Alliances Françaises USA on her brand new rhyming book, Paris by Phone, where we will see the magic of independence meets the meaning of home. We'll also be discussing with Pamela what it's like to live in Paris, how she learned French, and the history and origins of the Americans in Paris story. We are expecting several hundred guests today, or at least a couple hundred, I should say, and I'll make these opening announcements just a little bit slowly so that we can allow people time to settle into the room. I'd like to acknowledge Melissa Sora, based in Maryland. She is our National Programs Administrator, and she is managing the Zoom control room for us today. Because we have a good sized crowd today, I want to tell you about our upcoming events. Melissa, if you'll go to the next slide. Thank you. This program today is part of our national events program, and we have a few events coming up that you might be interested in. Next Tuesday, we have the Secrets of Mastering French, where we're going to gather some experts from all corners of the USA network to talk about, well, how to master French. And then on Tuesday, we can have the opportunity to see Pamela again because the Federation is sponsoring her session on Coco Chanel, where she'll be interviewing Rhonda Gerlich. And then in a couple of weeks, we have in French this time, a discussion with Scott Carpenter. He's the author of French Like Moi. We've had him in the past, but that was in English. And this time we'll do it in French. Then also in French, in early March, we have André Nerman. He's a French performer. He will do Molière for us with a very contemporary twist. And then a couple of weeks after that, we'll have Susan Herman Loomis. She's a very well-known cookbook author, and she'll be telling us about her latest cookbook, The Plat du Jour. So we invite you to visit your local chapter's website or afusa.org, and you can find out about these events, sign up for them. Last but not least, they are free to all Alliance Française and AATF members and guests of the presenters. Next slide, please. Because we have a good-sized group today, we want to show you a good-sized list of logistics and format notes to keep in mind. We are going to ask you to stay on mute during the presentation. We will ask you to use the chat feature for submitting your questions for the question and answer period in just a little while. We suggest that you stay on speaker view. We also remind you that because Pamela will be showing some wonderful images from her book, that you can, on your end, control the size or the display of the images. You can resize them if you'd like to see them a little bit more clearly. That's on your end. And then, knock on wood, in the event of the rare technical issues that some of us experience from time to time on Zoom, on the internet, if you do have any issues at all, then you can sign back in after a couple minutes using the original Zoom link. And then finally, this event is being recorded today. If for any reason you're not comfortable with that, then of course now is the time for you to exit. And then finally, our total runtime today will be about an hour. Next slide, please, Melissa. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Pamela, who's our featured speaker today. Many of you know her from her work as a writer at the New York Times, a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Many of you in the audience today, I think, also know her from her several books, including the international bestseller, Bringing Up Bébé. And in fact, many of us in the Alliance network had the opportunity to meet Pamela. I'm an example, back in 2013 when she did her book tour in the United States and visited many Alliance Françaises, including mine here in Portland. Pamela is also an Emmy Award winner for a documentary that she did on a French forger who operated during World War II. And like many of us here in the audience today, Pamela has lived in a number of different places around the world and most recently, of course, she has lived in Paris. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Pamela today. Thank you. So Pamela, we are so honored to have you here with us today. We have a few questions prepared, but I was wondering if we could prevail on you to show us your book.
Well, twist my arm, Linda. I would be glad to show it to you. I'll just share the screen now. Just so nobody gets too nervous, it's only 32 pages, some of which are double pages, so it'll go by really quickly. Here we go. It's called Paris by Phone, illustrated by Benjamin Shaw. Josephine Harris really likes Paris. In France, the kids eat chocolate rolls and take their poodles out for strolls. They stay up late to roast their snails and send each other French emails. At dinner, Joe says, "Mommy, please, the French would never call this cheese." That's supposed to be macaroni and cheese. "And really, Mother, what's the use of life without some chocolate mousse?" Her mom, who has a deadline soon, says, "Josephine, go to your room." "Mommy, you're mean and you're not a good mother. I'll pick up this phone and I'll find me another." The phone beeps and it rings, it totters and tones, it screeches and scratches and rattles and moans. Joe drifts off to a distant shore, then hears a voice that says, "Bonjour." When she opens her eyes, she is in a new room with an elegant lady who smells of perfume. From the red of her lips to the beige of her sweater, she's like Josephine's mother, but quite a bit better. "Josephine, my chérie, we're so glad that you've come. My name is Odile du Château du French Bun. Let's get you dressed and we'll go have some fun." A little boy who's named Pierre gives Josephine a cold French stare. "What are you doing with my mère?" "Pierre, be polite and get off the bench. Let's show Josephine how to be French." I'm sorry for my really bad fake French accent. A cat is a chat and no is no. On y va means, come on, let's go. In gardens built for kings and queens, French children jump on trampolines. And when they're done, they shout, "Encore!" In French, that means, "We want some more." Josephine can't help but smile. Even the joggers run with style. They look at art, then watch ballet, and Jo receives her first beret. And then you turn the page to the dancers, which is a silent page. "Odile, Pierre, this is so cool, but don't you go to work and school?" "Welcome to the nation that is always on vacation." I'm pretty sure that girl in the blue sweater at the top there is me, but Benjamin has not confirmed this. To have the proper Paris day, we must eat oysters in a cafe. Odile, pardon, I hate to be petty, but could I please just have some spaghetti? To grow your little appetite, I do insist you take a bite. Jo loves the oyster, it tastes like the sea. Pierre says, "Now you're French like me." But Jo wishes that her mom could see. Just then Odile says, "Look at the hour. We still have time for the Eiffel Tower." Then Odile says, "The perfect city through and through. It's obviously meant for you. Stay here with Pierre and me. You'll be so chic, so French, so free. All that you need to say is oui." And Jo says, "Thank you for this Paris day, but I don't think that I can stay. There's someplace else where I belong. I miss my house, my room, my mom." Jo gives Pierre and Odile a bisou and tells the little cat adieu. The phone crackles and crizzles and sizzles and sweps. It guzzles and gizzles and rizzles and rubs. As Joe's voyage starts to slow, she wakes up to her mom's hello. In Paris, I had my own brother, Pierre. A trampoline sent us high in the air. I even had a real French mare. The one thing wrong was you weren't there. Paris is perfect. I hated to part. But home is the place. They know you by heart. Though when she spots her phone, Joe thinks, next time, Rome.
Thank you, Pamela. That was wonderful. I flash back as a mother myself to the classics, The Runaway Bunny and Are You My Mother? And I think the audience probably has some similar impressions like that. So Melissa, if we haven't already opened up the chat, you can go ahead and open up the chat and we welcome your comments. I would like to go ahead and just ask you a few questions that we've prepared and then we'll get some from the audience. Well, so when will the book be released? Can it be ordered now?
It's coming out in 3 days. It's already for sale through all booksellers. I think even the Kindle version is already available. But if it's ordered now, it'll arrive by the day that the book comes out.
Okay, so next Tuesday is the official release date. So we might just be some of the only people in the world who've had a chance to see this book.
Yeah, and I've never read it to an audience before, so that was really nice experience. Even though I couldn't hear any of your reactions.
Yeah, well, we're getting some great reactions in the chat, so it was very much appreciated. So for the first question, you are super well known, of course, for your books for adults. So the first question on everyone's mind is likely to be, how did you get the idea of writing your first rhyming picture book?
It wasn't my idea. After Bringing Up Baby came out, I was approached by a children's book editor from Penguin in the US who asked me if I would be interested in writing a children's book. And I immediately said yes, because I immediately knew not necessarily what the book would be about. She wanted it to be somehow inspired by Bringing Up Baby. Not in any kind of literal way, but somehow the story would reflect Bringing Up Baby. But I knew I wanted to write a rhyming book because I've always loved writing rhymes. I've always been the person who, like, for your birthday would write like a song about your life to the tune of New York, New York. In my counterfactual life, I'm, writing musicals, not the music, but definitely the book. So I was really excited and I had little kids. So I had been reading wonderful children's books for years, reading the good ones over and over. And I knew that I felt like I had a sense of what, I didn't know if I could do it, but I had a sense of what makes the really great children's books work so well and make you want to make you find something new in them every time you read them. So I was inspired by the challenge.
Oh, that's great. And that ties in with my next question is that not many of us in today's audience, of course, are authors of rhyming picture books. So can you tell us just a little bit about the process and the timeline?
Sure. Well, I had the project to write a children's book and I had to figure out what it was going to be about. And I had this argument with my daughter. She was frustrated because I wouldn't let her stay up late. And she said to me in this moment of kind of anger and frustration, I'm gonna pick up this phone and I'm gonna find myself another mother. She really said that. And in fact, in the real conversation, she said afterward, and she's gonna smoke, which I think was sort of reflected my concern about secondhand smoke in Paris at the time. And it really struck me that that kids are stuck with the families they're born into. You think you're just in a house and you can walk at any time, but this is your whole world. And it also struck me that the phone, this kind of modern device, is a way out, and that's something I could play with the book. I did not know when I wrote the book that we were all going to be like literally trapped in our homes or in our neighborhoods in our cities because of the pandemic. But there's a strange kind of parallel with that as well. And so then I started, this is a slightly long-winded answer to your question, but then I started thinking about Paris, and Paris as the fantasy escape place for Americans, and the place we think, you know, if I want to change my life completely, I'll just sell everything and quit my job and move to Paris, and everything will be better there. And I even thought about this Russian movie I had seen years and years ago. It's set in Soviet times in a communal apartment, and the people living in this apartment find a kind of trap door, a portal that leads to Paris, and they all climb through it. And you know, it's Paris is the opposite of the sort of dismal Soviet reality. So I wanted to write a book that somehow integrated all these elements, and that had some resonances with bringing up Bebe. So there are elements of that as well.
Oh, that's great. So you just talked about, well, rhyming and your process of the book. I have a question. How did you settle on the name of Josephine, Joe for short, as your main character? And in the chat, I noticed that someone has asked if Josephine's character is based on a real person.
I guess for legal reasons, I should say she is not. She is a purely fictional character. I think she was probably inspired by, you know, I have a daughter who was about the age that Josephine is when she started writing the book. The concierge of my building had a cat named Napoleon. And so I originally wanted Napoleon to be in the book. And I think somehow from Napoleon, I got to Josephine. And also I needed a name that rhymes with a lot. So,
Well, yeah. So, and of course, Harris, the last name was probably pretty easy because that rhymed with Paris. But yeah, Josephine, I was curious for us. So, did you have any particular literary inspirations as you were in the creative process?
Where the Wild Things Are, the Marie Sendak book, is just by far my favorite children's book, and it's one that I've read hundreds of times. So I definitely studied that as a model. This movie, To See Paris and Die, and the literature about Americans in Paris, which I'm sure we'll talk about, inspired me too. You know, I sort of wondered, what is it about Paris in particular that captures the imagination of Americans in particular? I think Josephine is American, although I don't come out and say that in the book.
Oh yeah, that's interesting because I hadn't realized. I had just assumed she was American. So you talked about the myth of the American in Paris. Can you talk a little bit more about where that comes from and why you think we might be fascinated with that?
Sure. Well, the American in Paris, since I moved to Paris, which was in a way accidental, I wasn't one of these Americans who moved here because she dreamed of being a Parisian. I hadn't studied French. I grew up in Miami studying Spanish and speaking Spanish, and I was a journalist covering Latin America. I lived in Argentina and Mexico and Brazil. And suddenly I found myself in Paris, and I was able to sell articles to the American media about, like, I wrote an article about doing therapy in French. I did one about trying to find a turkey to roast on Thanksgiving. I joked once to an editor that I could write an article about, like, how the French take out the garbage and Americans would, you know, and I thought, what is it about? And then when I got quite ill here right before my book came out, and I had this American editor approach me and say, well, can you do a book about being like an American in Paris with cancer? And I thought, this is crazy. But actually, like, then I even wrote that in my last book. I have a whole section about what that was like. So it was interesting. I've looked a lot at the myth of the American in Paris and where it came from. And I think it started even before America was a country. Benjamin Franklin came to Paris on a kind of reconnaissance mission for the budding United States. He was doing some negotiations with the French court. And he writes letters back to America that kind of set the foundation for what the American in Paris myth is going to be like. And he writes that he has started wearing new clothes because the Parisians are so fashionable. He starts wearing a new style of wig with the Parisian style. He's kind of titillated by the French non-Puritan sexual norms. And he writes in one letter back that I was very nearly making love to my friend's wife. So that kind of sets the tone for the way that Americans are forever after going to see the French. The idea is that you come to Paris as to become sophisticated and to become transformed by the sort of superior knowledge, superior aesthetics, by the French way of life. And then you go back to America and you sort of bring that home. And you see that over the centuries continue to happen. So you have for example, in the 1950s, like Jacqueline Bouvier, that, pre-Kennedy, did her study abroad year at the Sorbonne, and so she's an example of the sort of aristocrats treating Paris as a sort of finishing school, where with again a sophistication that you bring back to the U.S. And I think France and Paris is far enough away for Americans to be this kind of mythic place. It's not really for the British, for example. They just kind of pop up across the channel. They know what it is. But for Americans, it's most people can afford to come here. It's definitely a kind of, a certain social class that comes to France. And so you have movies like The American in Paris, where Gene Kelly sings about how like Paris isn't really a place, it's a mood, it's an idea, it's a way of being. And this continues until today. And you look at like the Netflix series, it's been such a hit during the pandemic, which maybe you're planning to talk about, Emily in Paris, which again plays on this exact same myth. So there's no killing it. And I certainly wouldn't want to, because it's, it's kind of, it's something nice to play with. And I think one thing about France is that it's far enough away to be, as I said, kind of hazy, dreamlike, and it's different enough to be exotic, but it's similar enough to be relatable, and it's safe. It's everyone wants to send their daughters to study abroad in France, because it's seen as, France is one country we've never been at war with. They were our first ally, so it's seen as a kind of reliably exotic, but digestible at the same time. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question.
Oh, no. I think that's great, and I love the idea of exotic, but digestible at the same time. It's an adventure, but it's an adventure where you feel pretty safe. That's a really, really, really good point. And then just bouncing around with some other questions about the book. I absolutely love the depiction of the harried American working mom with the cat on her desk and the crumpled papers all around her. I don't know, it might be too tedious for you to bring that image up, but I'm curious if there was any autobiographical source for that one.
Well, she says she has a deadline, and that's pretty much what my constant refrain to my kids is like, I can't talk, I'm on a deadline. And my daughter actually made a song once that was something like, I have a deadline, woo, woo, woo. Like, they think that that's just part of life, is to have these constant deadlines. But I think I don't manage them with much grace. My husband, who's also a journalist, does a much better job of that. So I think, and then there's the moment at the end where the deadline is over and the mother feels incredible regret by how self-absorbed she's been. In my case, I'm often on my deadlines writing about my children. So there's a paradox of them being the material, but not benefiting from it in any way. So yeah, I guess I'm that harried mom in the sweatpants.
Yeah, I really like that. The crumpled papers all around her. That was just great. And then just swinging widely in another direction, we encounter in the book some interesting cultural aspects, many interesting culture. One of them was the cold French stare. I thought it was super cute that Pierre, being the example of the cold French stare, I thought to myself, do children in France learn that fairly early on? Can you tell us more about the cold, disapproving French stare?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad you picked up on that aspect of it. I put in the book the idea that Josephine becomes more and more French, or starts to feel more and more French as she goes along. Because one question I get, and I bet people in the audience have gotten too, is always, since I've lived here so long, do you feel French or do you feel American? And what does it mean to feel French? Or what does that have any significance? Or how can you transform the way you feel as a person, your kind of internal way of explaining the world to yourself? And in my last book, I did some research about how Americans see the world and versus other places, and I realized there is a way of feeling American or feeling French and processing information. And I think it's kind of hard to put your finger on, but some researchers have. I think Americans are encouraged to study their own feelings and their own preferences and judge a situation from their own point of view. And I guess the contrasting position to this, according to the sort of social science researchers, is the East Asian way of seeing the world, which is based more on looking at unspoken cues, nonverbal cues. I mean, Americans depend very heavily on, they want things to be transparent, they want to say what they mean, and they assume that people, if they say something, they mean it. And the East Asian model is more that you assume that there are nonverbal cues. The great example that they use is like, in America, you ask a guest, what kind of sandwich do you want? And the East Asian model is to sort of intuit from what you know about the person, what kind of sandwich they must want, and to bring them that sandwich, and that's the perfect moment. Whereas America would be like, you didn't ask me if I wanted mayo on my sandwich. And I think, sorry, this is another long-winded answer, but it's the French model is somewhere in between, where you are encouraged to know especially as a woman, to know your own mind, to know your own preferences, but not to say exactly what you mean. That would be a sign of naivete in France, to say exactly what you mean. You know, Rousseau talks about this kind of the dance of people kind of trying to outwit each other. But at the same time, to reveal your true self selectively. So I think probably behind the cold French stare is this desire to have the power to coldly assess situations and to sort of know what's going on. And I think this is a very highly valued quality in France, to know the score, to read the room at work, in your family, in terms of your personal life. And you see this in French women's magazines and interviews with actresses, for example. You'll have them, in the American magazines, you'll have a lot of them saying, I care so much about my kids, and they're trying to prove that they're good mothers and good people. And in the French interviews, like with actresses like Charlotte Gainsbourg and all these people we've heard of, it's often saying, I like to be a little bit unstable, and giving these like sort of very, sometimes negative, but very precise descriptions of themselves. So I think it's an important cultural difference. It's kind of hard to put your finger on, but I think in a way that's what it means to feel French. And maybe one can be converted into that point of view, but it's hard.
So when you're getting the cold, disapproving French stare, it's because you're not acting the way that the French person is expecting.
I think there's that as well. That's a much better answer to the question, actually.
But no, it's because they have certain standards, like you explained. They have standards on how you would perform, and then when you're not doing that, it's their job to tell you with a cold stare that you're not.
Yes, I mean, this is a place with a lot of rules, and they will tell you immediately when you've broken them.
Okay. Next, the widely swinging question. I love the way that you spliced in so many aspects of real life in Paris, like squeezing a family into a skinny ancient elevator, or eating oysters in an outdoor cafe, which I absolutely did on my last trip to Paris. So how did you get those inspirations? Were they all from your lived experience, or did you pull ideas from friends, or how did you select those aspects of real French life?
I thought the elevators, that is the elevator in the building that I live in. If you're claustrophobic, I don't recommend moving to a Parisian building, because I've seen some that are even half the size of the one in our building, which you couldn't fit, more than a tiny little box in. Because of course they're built in the middle of stairways in old buildings, so they're naturally limited. So I thought that was a fun image. I imagine Josephine there. And for the oyster, I really wanted to incorporate an aspect of Bringing Up Bébé, which was kids and food. And I didn't want to be too pedantic about it, but I thought this was one area where the French had this very interesting idea where they tell kids, you don't have to eat everything, but you do have to taste it. You have to take one bite. And it's a way of discouraging or not allowing picky eating, and encouraging kids to have, from a very young age, a very diverse palate, or as diverse as possible. And I don't really know how many French kids eat oysters. My kids love oysters. They also love snails. Maybe I should have done snails, but that was just a bit too far, a bridge too far for this American girl. But I wanted, so that was that. It was a chance to incorporate that.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I wondered when I saw that page if maybe you had pulled that tip from Bringing Up Baby. And then I noticed there was a question in the chat. A few people did arrive a little bit late. So once we get through the questions and answers, maybe we can convince Pamela to just take us quickly through the illustrations again, because that way you'll be able to connect some of the discussion that we've had with the images. And then point number, see, another question for you. I think that the way that you segued into the nation always on vacation is going to make the audience really, really jealous. I mean, it was great the way that you led up to it in the book. It was perfect. So what are your comments on that?
My comments is that every 6 weeks there are 2 weeks of school holidays here, which I don't think people, I mean, 2 weeks is, the American style of 2 weeks is not enough, but the French style of relentless holidays, all of which have to be planned and paid for, and it's an interruption of your job, is challenging. I think there must be a happy medium.
And then I think when we go through the book, or maybe Melissa, could you bring up the slide on your illustrator? I see that we have some questions in the chat about the illustrator. I wanted just to mention that it's just amazing how the words and the images in the book really make magic together. So can you tell us more about Benjamin Shaw?
Sure. I was looking for an illustrator. I really wanted a French illustrator because I thought it would, I'd read a lot of French children's books, and I thought they had a really unique sensibility, and that bringing that to an American audience would be really exciting and fresh for Americans. And I looked around for an illustrator, and then I realized that so many of the French children's books I really loved had all been illustrated by this one guy, Benjamin Shaw. He did this incredible book. He did the Pomelo series, if anyone has seen that, about a pink elephant named Pomelo. He's illustrated a lot of books that he didn't write the text for, and some that he did write the text for, including one about a kid who accidentally goes to school naked called Toute Nue, which it was just one of my favorites, and my kids loved it. So I got in touch with Benjamin, and he lives out of town. He lives in a tiny little village, but he was coming through Paris, and we met at this magical restaurant inside a train station. And from the beginning, he was like a character out of a children's book. We were in this this very old restaurant, and fortunately his wife had read Bringing Up Bébé and liked it, so I think it gave him confidence, and then he liked the text, and then he just ran with it, and he came up with, I really wanted somebody who was going to not just illustrate my words but add humor and add his own ideas, and he very much did that. I mean, his illustrations are just so dynamic. And what it turns out, I've never written a children's book before, but it turns out one of the biggest problems with children's book writers is they have too many words, and often the words will replicate what you see in the picture. And so a lot of the editing process was just about cutting text, because my editor kept saying, like, we know she's doing that. We can see it. So there's a lot of paring back.
Oh yeah, I love the colors that he used in his illustration, and I saw that he's from the south of France, so that started to make sense.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
Yeah, and then easy question, I hope. Where can one see the trampolines for children in Paris?
Does anyone know? Could you put in chat if you know where those trampolines are? I was wondering if anyone would recognize the spot.
Not seeing any answers yet.
No, it's in the Tuileries Gardens, that are the gardens attached to the Louvre. And in fact, Claudia was just a little slow, but you still get credit for that. In fact, they are in-ground trampolines, which means they're flush with the ground. They're really fun. There are about 8 of them. They're all together, and you buy tickets, and kids get to jump on them for about 5 minutes. I've heard they're even open now during the pandemic. But it was very hard for Benjamin to draw in-ground trampolines and transmit what they were. So he drew them as traditional trampolines, but in the Tuileries Gardens.
Okay, thank you. I'll have to look for those the next time. I don't think I've ever seen them.
And there's one big change from only one thing has really changed in Paris since since he did the drawings less than a year ago, which is there's a scene where even the joggers run with style, where she's looking at the street that runs past the Tuileries and also runs past the Louvre. It's the Rue de Rivoli. And that street in Paris has now been closed to private cars. It's bikes only, plus taxis and buses. So that one of the scenes from the book has been just totally transformed. It was a change they made during the pandemic to make Paris more bike friendly and to help people avoid public transportation because it was going to be too crowded. And the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, has now said that that's a permanent change. So for people who come back to Paris, when the country and the borders open up again, I think they'll be very surprised and delighted to see what a bike-friendly city Paris is becoming.
So that brings me to another point that I wanted to ask you about. Is it true, what I've heard, that Paris has a bit more of a smaller hometown feel than it did during the pandemic without all the tourists? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I don't know who said that, but that's a really good point. At first, when the lockdown happened in March, I felt very conspicuous all of a sudden speaking English or having an accent in Paris because suddenly everyone was French. There were no tourists. There are some Americans who live here, but you were restricted to the neighborhood that you're in. So, but on the other hand, I've never felt such a sense of, I guess, ownership of Paris because there are very few cars. And so we got to see what Paris looked like without traffic. And pretty much the only physical activity besides walking that we were allowed to do was to go jogging a kilometer from our house. And so I started jogging, sometimes with my kids, sometimes alone, every night. And I realized, which I'd never known before because there were cars clogging the road, that I could jog to the Seine in 10 minutes and that I could sort of weave back and forth over various bridges over the Seine and run on the Ile Saint-Louis and all of these places that I thought of as like technically part of Paris, but not part of my neighborhood. I live near République in the eastern part of Paris. Were actually very accessible in that the city of Paris, if you look inside the Périphérique ring road, is really very tiny, and which makes the biking, the expansion of biking routes and bike paths all the more exciting.
Oh, that's good. That's great. Well, I can't wait to look for all that the next time I'm there. Just segueing a little bit into language. At the Alliance Française, we're all about learning French. Can you tell us about your own journey to the Alliance, to learning French? I'll get it out.
So I moved to Paris in 2004, and I moved here because I met a fellow who was not even French, but who's British, but who had escaped London and the real estate prices in London and moved to Paris. So I moved here to be with him. I took some French classes before I left, actually at FIAF, the Alliance Française in New York City, before I left and kind of got my feet wet. And then when I moved to Paris, I started taking classes at the Alliance Française in Paris. So I guess it's the mothership of all Alliance Française. And then I've been back since to take some more French classes, even in the past few years. People ask me sometimes, like, is your French fluent or do you still have an accent? I grew up in Miami, which is an immigrant city, and I knew adults who had moved to Miami from Cuba and other places in Latin America when they were in their 20s, and obviously they still had accents when they were in their 60s. I was learning French for the first time in my 30s. I knew it was going to be hard, and my biggest problem, I think, is that my household is in English, and I work a lot from home, so I speak English to my kids were all born in France. I've always only spoken English to them. They speak back to me in English. My husband speaks, I speak English with my husband. So I have never had enough of a full immersion experience. And I spoke recently to some language researchers about this. And I said, why is it that my French can get, quite good. I understand everything that people say, but it's far from perfect. I still kind of puzzle over the same words over and over again. And he said, even for kids, it's not that you could just like sort of have a kid dive into a language or be exposed to a language for 6 months and he's fluent. It really is a language acquisition, especially to get to a native level, is very long and arduous. A kid needs to have 6 or 7 years of total immersion in order to speak like a native speaker. And he has to start that immersion when he or she is about 11 years old in order to have the full immersion experience before you reach a certain age, which is about 20. And people don't actually perfect their their ability to speak a language until they're around 30. So, and the other thing he said, which I thought was really interesting, is native speakers make almost no mistakes. I mean, they have just an incredible command of the language. So if you're at 90% with a language, even 95%, you still sound very foreign. So any mistakes really mark you as a foreigner. So he said to me, if you started playing golf when you were 35, you wouldn't expect to play with the pros. Like, you wouldn't be beating yourself up because your golf game isn't perfect. But with language, people hold themselves to such a high level. Obviously, these are all just excuses for the fact that my French is not better. And the other thing that he said, which I thought was very interesting, is that it's very easy to get to a level where you understand most of the language. But in every article you read, every interaction you have, there'll be some occasional expressions. That's part of the richness of native speech, of the languages. There's so much variety. And to get all those little twists, all those turns of phrase, all those occasional words is really very hard. But I'm trying. I'm still trying. I spend every morning with Lamont circling words, and I have this notebook where I keep them all, and I keep looking at the same words over and over again. But I aspire to more than I actually achieve. But
that's very common in the Alliance Française. We know that it takes a little bit of effort every day to maintain and try to perfect your French. But of course, it's okay to make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Even I can say even French people make quite a few mistakes.
That's true.
So we don't have to feel bad about that. We did have a question in the chat about can you tell us about your children's level of French and how they do?
I am not the best judge of my children's level of French, but I am told that they sound like native speakers. Yeah, I think the fact that they don't have French-speaking parents gives them a disadvantage with French. Because just as parents, English-speaking parents correct their kids' grammar and pronunciation, if they had French parents, they'd have somebody tweaking their French all the time, and they don't have that. Hopefully their friends play that role. The problem is American television is so good. They love American. I think they're quite Anglophone too. They're quite comfortable in English. So we'll see. It's a balance.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
The one thing I want to say about that I wanted to do with the book is include a number. As those of you who were here for the reading saw, there are a number of French phrases in the book. There are about 15. And there isn't in this PDF I have of the book, but there is in the actual book a lexicon at the end that explains what all those words mean and how to pronounce them.
Oh, okay, great. Well, that'll be great, especially for parents and grandparents reading the book to their children that can use a little help with their French. And then a question that's come up in the chat is, for what age is the book intended? What ages?
So the idea is that you can start reading to your child from the time he or she is born. So I would say 0 to 8, but some older kids have read it and they enjoy it too. It is the kind of book that's like many rhyming picture books, parents will typically, or grandparents will read to kids, or teachers will read to kids. So.
And then, thank you. So 0 to 8 and maybe older. That's great. And then how about, Pamela, what other children's books in French would you recommend in addition to your own?
Children's books in French?
Yes.
Definitely any of the books by Benjamin Shaw, the illustrator of my book. I talk in Bringing Up Bébé about the Perfect Princess series, which is really cute. It's about learning manners in French. What are some of the other? There's École de Loisirs is a publisher, and they just have a host of like really wonderful books for little kids. Some of them very graphic. Some of them are good for French learning, and some of them require only like a very basic level of French. So I'd look at École de Loisirs.
Oh, that's great. And for the audience, if we have French learners in the audience, reading children's books is a great way to perfect your own French, because you'll find yourself dropping into a natural rhythm. Then let's see, swinging wildly again. What do you think the future of the bisou is?
The outlawed bisou, the kiss for Well, it's been a long time since I've given anyone who doesn't live in my apartment a bisou. So hopefully one day we will get to bisou each other again. It's
Okay. No,
yeah.
so you're expecting it'll come back, because I guess there's
Oh,
some
is there
people
talk that
there's some people prophesying that it won't come back at all.
No, it's so wonderful. It's so warm.
Well, that's good to know that there's going to be some opposition to it not coming back ever.
I think once it's safe, people are yearning to connect with each other again in all kinds of ways.
Okay, another question on the closing. Paris is perfect. I hate to part, but home is the place they know you by heart. Did you have trouble coming up with the closing? I just imagined that it would be kind of hard to figure out how to close off the book. And then, of course, from there it goes to next place, Rome.
Yes,
which is wonderful. But did you have troubles, or did that just come naturally?
I had a little rhyming help from my niece in London. She had a suggestion about that, about how I hated to part, but I knew I wanted to have that expression, home is the place where they know you by heart. And it comes from this French expression, to know someone by heart. When you're a really close friend of theirs, you know them by heart. And I just found that very touching and beautiful. And I wanted it to be someplace in the book. And in general, I just really love French expressions and foreign expressions. So I'm always on the lookout for them. And I hear new ones all the time. One of my favorite French expressions is "live hidden, live happy," which is kind of culturally the opposite of American, where you're supposed to, be honest and explain yourself and expose yourself. And the French idea is that, a few secrets are a good idea. They make your life even better.
Okay. We have some questions in the chat. Melissa, if it's okay with you, if you would take off the inability of people to unmute themselves, because I see that Jane Robert has a question, and I would invite Jane to unmute herself if she can and come on camera and ask her question.
Hi, Pamela. I'm a retired French teacher, and I'm on the board of trustees of a university which supports the AATF, Webster University in St. Louis. And the big issue in the United States, which I'm sure you know, are students not enrolling in French classes. It's not that the departments are getting smaller or there's fewer offerings. They're closing. They're disappearing. And it's very hard to find the right words that appeal to high school and college students in the United States of the value. And you have the audience of the AATF right on your screen. So it might be something that I think you could maybe contribute a lot to those thoughts, if not right now, sometime.
I think the French government is doing a pretty good job of encouraging in the early years French bilingual education. I've been shocked by the number of French bilingual elementary schools there are in the US now. So it may be, obviously Spanish is a strong competitor in the US with very good reason, but I think there is a kind of burgeoning interest in French. In part because there's also just a very strong interest now among middle-class American parents and others in bilingualism, because of the neurological benefits and just the sense that America is no longer the center of the universe necessarily, that we are going to have to go out and learn other languages. So I feel like I certainly understand the problem you're describing at the university level, but I think there may be a kind of rising cohort of young people who, just by virtue of the fact that they are fluent in French, will be interested in doing French literature and French history and moving forward with that in the later years of school. Okay.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Henry Druckerman. I guess he might be related to you. He asked, how do you correct your children's English?
Yeah, I didn't quite understand that question. I just say no, say it that way.
Okay, well, that's simple enough. And then for those of you in the audience that did not see the book when we first opened up, I think we'll reserve the last 5 minutes for walking quickly through the book. But Melissa, do you see any other questions in the chat that we have skipped?
Yes, several people have asked the name of the Russian book with the trap door and the passage to Paris.
It's a movie, in fact.
Oh, a movie, okay.
Called To See Paris and Die.
I have a question. I don't know how to do it.
Okay, so we have somebody else that would like to ask a question. What's your name, please?
Veronica, can you hear
Okay,
me?
Veronica. Yes, go ahead. What's your question?
So I would like to ask Pamela if, because she mentioned Emily in Paris, which I loved and I watched, but I absolutely love Call My Agent. Can you say anything about that?
I love that show. I would say it's one of my favorite shows. I love it. I love Call My Agent because Emily in Paris shows Paris as this kind of fantasy place, you know, where the sun is always shining, and
Very good.
even French people speak English to each other when we're not in the room. I'm not sure it's sort of like that fact-based. Whereas Call My Agent, while it's about a certain social strata in Paris, it's, you know, high-powered celebrities and professionals. It definitely makes Paris feel like a real city that you really live in. So I love the show. I think it's really smart, and the characters are wonderful. It brings some of the best elements of French film, but also some of the sort of speed and velocity of American television. So I think the filmmaker does a wonderful job.
There is
Okay.
a one.
And of course, of course, we can't talk about current series without mentioning Lupin. Pamela, what's your take on Lupin?
We are big Lupin fans in my home. I was told that Lupin was actually written by an Englishman, and you can kind of see that. It doesn't have the feeling of a French series necessarily. I hope my husband isn't listening. I'm obviously in love with Omar Sy, and yeah, it's fantastic. A little bit scary, but it's so well done. And it's shot in my neighborhood, so.
Okay, and it looks like we have a question for Barbara. Did you have a question?
Yes. Hi, Pamela. I love the book, and it actually takes me back to being a child with those fantasies. And I'm wondering if you would do this as a series a la Madeleine.
I would love to do another children's book. It was so much, it was a lot of work, but a lot of fun to write. It was really a labor of love. And I feel like I understand the process better now, and I would absolutely love to do another one. And there's a lot more to tell. Like, I was imagining Josephine having a single mom, but maybe there's a dad somewhere in the picture, and maybe there's a complicated story to tell there. I don't know. And it doesn't have to, you know, she talks about going to Rome. So I think, you know, there could be an Italian version as well. And of course, I'd have to go to Rome and do a lot of research in order to write that. So.
Just put that in your budget with your publisher, right?
Absolutely, the pasta budget.
Yes. And then, Melissa, do you have any other questions? Do we have any other questions from the chat though?
Yes, there was one other question about the book. You told us that a few of the scenes show the Rue de Rivoli and the Jardin des Tuileries. Are there any other specific neighborhoods that are depicted in the book, or are they just more general scenes?
I think we'd have to ask Benjamin. There's one scene where she's walking along the Seine. So that's probably I think it's like a specific stretch of the Seine, and the Eiffel Tower, of course. Yeah, I think it's Benjamin's view of Paris. So he kind of decided where to put it, but I don't necessarily know where everything is. I know at one point there's a scene at the end where he had to mix two neighborhoods, where you have there's the Eiffel Tower in the background, and there's like a sort of street scene at dusk, and he said he had to mix two neighborhoods in order to be able to frame the Eiffel Tower that way, and so he took some artistic liberties.
Two very practical questions that have come up from the chat. One is the book available not just on Amazon, but at other independent booksellers?
The book is definitely available through any booksellers, including independent booksellers. On my website, which is pameladruckerman.com, there's a book page with all booksellers, or like 6 or 7 different booksellers available. But yes, you can request it absolutely anywhere.
And can folks from the media contact you on your website?
Yes, please feel free. There's a contact form, and I'll get it right away in my email.
Okay, great. Melissa, any other questions? Or do we cover them all?
I think we covered them.
Okay, good. So what I'll suggest, we just have a couple of minutes left, especially for those of you who didn't see the book at the end or who want to review it. If Pamela, you could bring it up again we're going to ask everybody to stay on mute, and Pamela, you don't need to read it again. I thought maybe we just walk through the pages very quickly and make a couple of comments, and then that'll probably be pretty much a wrap for today. So here at the left, you see Benjamin Shaw again. That's the illustrator that worked with Pam on this. Yes.
Okay. And this is the title page.
And here's the part where we learned that Harris rhymes with Paris, and we talked about the origins of Josephine. Here's the scene with the mom with the messy desk, which Pamela said might be a little bit autobiographical. I also want to contrast. Look at this image of the table where things are a little bit crazy, and then you'll see the French table a little bit later, and it's you'll see there's a difference.
It's all orderly. And there really are kids like this. And I talked to some of them when I was writing the book who are just obsessed with France. I think it's something in their mother's milk that they just get the French bug.
And then this is the connection with the voice that says bonjour. Now, Pamela, did you realize when you wrote this that there's actually a thing now of people connecting randomly with people from other countries on the phone?
No, I did not know about that.
It's a thing.
I've heard about it. Yeah, there were some people who talked for 8 hours or.
Well, you nailed it. That's a new thing.
Okay. It's the only technology I've ever predicted.
And then the perfume of the French woman, that was a nice. And then I adored this part. She's like Josephine's mother, but quite a bit better. So cute.
And then I really like the fact that Benjamin put chouquettes on the table. There's little round pastries with sugar. They're a sort of after-school snack often.
Mm-hmm. And this is Pierre's cold French stare that we talked about earlier. Yeah, I didn't notice the chouquette. I noticed them now. That's great.
He's so good at details. He's wonderful.
Here's the skinny elevator, folks. Isn't that's just precious?
I love that image. And all of these phrases and words are translated at the end of the book. So I hope people will be able to pronounce them while they're reading or eventually.
The trampolines, and then the people even jogging in style. I have to say I haven't seen that yet, but I did notice the fellow in the business suit on his scooter.
There are a lot of electric scooters now in Paris. And this, I guess, would have to be the Louvre and the Opera.
Mm-hmm. And the emphasis on the arts in general. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the one where you recall that welcome to the Z Nation that is always vacation. And you are probably the person holding the flowers in the upper middle of the balcony there.
I mean, that is my narcissistic fancy. I did not know if it was his intention.
On the street level, yeah. That's cute.
And this is the oyster scene.
Like I said, I think I did that 2 years ago, my last trip to Paris.
Wow.
And everybody has to go to the Eiffel Tower. It has to be in your book, right?
It's legally required to be in any book about France. At one point, I had her jumping off the Eiffel Tower, which it wasn't working. It was one of the scenarios we tried. It was too dark.
This is a great shot. The overview of Paris, where Paris very much looks like a community of homes. Yeah, it's wonderful.
And then this is where she sort of changes her mind about being French after all. And then she gets back on her phone and back into bed and wakes up.
It's a great ending.
Et voilà.
She's reminiscing. Next time, Rome. Yeah. Okay, so at this point, we're pretty much out of time. Thank you so much, Pamela. If we have a tradition that everybody goes off of mute if you would like to, and tell Pamela, or with your applause, show your appreciation for her time today. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Linda, thank you so much for having me on.